All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for one of the Center for Humanities Research Colloquia. And I want to give special thanks to Dominique Francesca at the Center for Humanities and Shah Jahan, also at the Center for Humanities, and Joe Fort and the Athenaeum for helping us to put this together. Today, we're very excited to have with us Dr. Andrea Baldwin, who is assistant professor in sociology. Dr. Baldwin completed her PhD at the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill in Barbados. Her research examines several areas: Black feminism, Black feminist pedagogy, Caribbean feminism, and transnational feminism. We're very excited that today she is going to be presenting on Black feminism, postcolonialism, and American higher education, gender, race, and the body. So please join me in welcoming Professor Baldwin. And so now we'll turn to your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Can everybody hear me well? Awesome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharing my screen with you, and then I'll start. Just give me 1 second. Okay. All right. All right. How do I? All right, cool. Okay, so today I'll be presenting a chapter from my monograph, which is based on a larger multidisciplinary humanities, technology, and arts research project I did with colleagues at my former institution. Let's see here. All right. The presentation will be divided into two. First, I will talk briefly about the theoretical framing I use for the monograph to kind of set the stage for the second part, which I will use the remaining of time to discuss and describe. And this is the project I mentioned, which has been integrated as part of the chapter in the book. For this second part, I just want to state that the information I present, including the examples of the project process and the final installation and performance, are beyond the scope of the actual book. But I just wanted to give an example all the way through of the type of work that spurred my thinking about the monograph. So let's start. So while doing research on two separate projects on gender and race in higher education, I became intrigued at how even despite claims of diversity and inclusion, the academy remained quite wedded to its racist, sexist, heteronormative genealogy. I became interested in, according to Sarah Ahmed in her 2012 book on Being Included, how the act of inclusion could be read as an act of maintaining exclusion. I thought about how, while today, higher education institutions are working to include more faculty, staff, and students of color, women, and queer folks to make the signs of exclusion disappear, that these signs in many cases were becoming more pronounced, and the negative effects of this inclusion and diversity work was being felt more profoundly. The preliminary results for these two research projects, one on the posture portraits in the 1920s to 60s, and the other on diversity and inclusion practices today, uncovered a through line where students of two different generations, working class students of color in 2018, and white upper middle class women in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were echoing the same sentiments about experiences of inclusion and exclusion. I became curious as to how two practices, both of which were and are propagated by the university decades apart, focusing on inclusion and exclusion, evoked similar responses from participants, responses of feeling frustrated, embarrassed, and of non-belonging. The information I collected from these projects shows what appears to be a through line which link historical and contemporary centralized university inclusion initiatives to feelings of discontent, particularly for gendered and racialized students. That link, I hypothesize, stems from what I refer to as the politics of indifference that have and continue to pervade the university, and the way in which this politics is deployed through what I refer to as an apathetic methodology of power. I define the politics of indifference as the seemingly detached, apathetic, reasoned, and systematic policy approaches by higher education institutions surrounding considerations of gender, race, and ethnicity, inclusion and exclusion, and how these policies lead to university sanctioned practices which have traumatic consequences for women and racialized other. The apathetic methodology of power is the way in which this politics of indifference is deployed, preying on what I currently refer to, borrowing from Bell Hooks's work on yearning, as the promise and politics of yearning. In the book, I use the two research projects as mentioned earlier as examples to demonstrate how the politics of indifference works through the use of an apathetic methodology of power. For the first project, The Posture Portraits, I detail how scientific data was collected by measuring students' bodies for straight and upright posture as a means of measuring intelligence and fitness, and so as to be included in the student body toward graduation and toward taking up one's place in society. I detail how this practice was not only based on the concept of healthism, which reinforced norms that constructed the healthy as normal and pure and the unhealthy as foreign and polluted, but how the university, through the use of so-called scientific methodology and academic rigor, enforced these racist, sexist, and ableist norms to enforce its policy of inclusion or exclusion without considering how their use of marginalized bodies as data to prove their own inclusion or exclusion policies would affect said bodies. And I'll give you more on this later. The other example detailed in the book is based on interviews I collected starting in the spring of 2016 until the fall of 2018. During that time, I interviewed 66 people, including students of color, faculty, staff, and administrators at a small private liberal arts college in New England, and made a short documentary. I interviewed them to gather information on whether, why, and how students of color engaged in self-care, what barriers existed that prevented students today from engaging in self-care, and the weathering effects. It is through this research that I learned more about how current inclusion and equity frameworks on campuses across the US engage in gathering data about their student body and their bodies, how they seek to include and exclude certain bodies through diversity recruitment, and how students felt counted, cautioned, and controlled so campuses could demonstrate comparable retention numbers to that of peer institutions. These two projects highlight how university use student bodies as data, what Ahmed refers to as perception data. This data, according to Ahmed, is used to inform work which becomes about generating the right image and correcting the wrong one. In both instances, then, the data collected by institutions were and are done for a particular purpose. That was not necessarily about the people whose data was being recorded, but rather these people were being used as instruments for the larger project of showing that the university was being managed and was managing its constituents in the best interest of society at large. This data could be used to demonstrate the value of the university as a place at the front lines of society, an arbiter and authority of knowledge through an experimentation on others. Especially in times of pervasive societal changes, the university needs to continue to solidify its position as the place of knowledge, even as it is challenged by those who, through its knowledge production, it has othered: women, folks of color, queer folks, and others. It must absorb these bodies as and through data and use that data to make bodies into things recounted, remeasured for inclusion or exclusion based on said recounting and remeasuring. And so in the text, I explore these two examples using a Black feminist decolonial lens to engage what this guy here, Ronaldo Walcott, calls reading practices. I engage in reading practices of the genealogy of the university with the purpose of telling a counter story. Reading practices, according to Walcott, include not only what we read, but also include how we read. That is, the desires, disappointments, pleasures, and investments that we bring to the text we read. Understanding how we read is important, and in this book, I use the examples mentioned above to read the textuality of the university in the same way that Dorian Corey in the 1991 documentary Paris is Burning defines a queer reading. In the film, Corey states, shade comes from reading. Reading came first. You get in a smart crack and everyone laughs and kikis because you found a flaw and exaggerated it. Then you've got a good reading going. Shade is, I don't tell you that you're ugly, but I don't have to tell you because you know you're ugly, and that's shade. Corey's statement that a good read is to find a flaw and exaggerate it is the type of reading I deploy in my book. I expose the flaws read as fictional images generated by the Academy through the use of perception data collected. I do so by using a Black feminist decolonial reading practice that goes beyond a mere retelling of a history of the US nation state project in which the Academy originates and is complicit, but that is informed, according to Walcott, by desires and disappointments, is tentative and attempts to situate struggle within history, and hence is able to assert other and different kinds of responses. By a Black feminist decolonial lens, my Black feminist decolonial lens is informed by Jennifer C. Nash's definition of Black feminisms, taken from her 2019 text, Black Feminism Reimagined, and it is worth citing here at length. Nash writes, and I quote, I treat Black feminisms as a varied project with theoretical, political, activist, intellectual, erotic, ethical, and creative dimensions. Black feminisms is multiple, myriad, shifting, and unfolding. To speak of it in the singular is always to reduce its complexity. I treat the word Black in front of feminisms not as a marker of identity, but as a political category. And I understand a Black feminist approach to be one that decenters analyses of racialized sexisms and homophobia, and foregrounds Black women as intellectual producers, as creative agents, as political subjects, and as freedom dreamers, even as the content and counters of these dreams vary, end quote. This Black feminisms is decolonial from the perspective, according to M. Jackie Alexander and Chandra Mohanty, that it allows us to make sense of the world in relationship to hegemonic power, allows us to imagine ourselves as agents outside of the repressive structures created by this power, and to envision and demand space where agency, autonomy, and self-determination would be at the center. In the Academy, such a lens is necessary, as Eurocentric modes of theorizing that suppress or at the very least fail to foster curiosity about non-Western contexts are complicit in neocolonial interventions here and abroad that impoverish our political imaginations from being informed by the exciting and transformative work being done on more egalitarian and inclusive terms. Within an academic setting then, a Black feminist decolonial political reading practice holds the possibilities for decentering the West. And it does so, I am hypothesizing, by doing three things. The first thing it does is that it engages with the written histories and archival information within and about the university, while also moving beyond these histories and archives to engage and privilege the experiences that remain missing, silent, invisible within these histories and archives. To engage the memories of those who endure the institution's policies of indifference, and for example, those who were forced to take the posture portraits from the 1920s to 60s. It, according to Saidiya Hartman, brushes history against the grain. That is, it evacuates at the margins of monumental history, turning to forms of knowledge and practice not generally considered legitimate objects of historical inquiry or appropriate or adequate sources for historical making, attending to the cultivated silence, exclusions, relations of violence and domination that engender official accounts. This Black feminist decolonial reading practice, I hypothesize, therefore seeks to include, according to Allen, the lived experience, discursive production, and voices previously muffled by the loud bass theory. According to Walcott, it enters into and moves past the world of fiction that is the archives. The second thing it does is that a Black feminist decolonial reading practice of the university engages with the pleasures and disappointments of those students who, through Western modernity, were and are read as others. It is also reflective as I pay attention to how I read. That is, what emotions do I bring to this reading as a first generation Black woman, immigrant from a low income working class family, come assistant professor at a predominantly white institution, who is also, like these students, caught in the crosshairs of the politics of indifference, forced through the apathetic methodology of power to submit to measurement for the purpose of extracting my data for university use. Our marked bodies become literal data. They exist as an indifference. That is, marked as different while navigating the space of difference, read as the space that is good or even exceptional at diversity, as the bodies that mark these spaces as such. A Black feminist decolonial reading practice is interested in how these students, many of whom may have been elated or pleased to enter the university, believing in the promise and politics of yearning, exist as different within difference, read diversity. How do these different bodies navigate difference as regulated mostly or solely as that difference, confined to participate in the ways that highlight this difference? How do those marked indifference, the politics and the perception, navigate these spaces in difference by conforming to and or pushing back against this said indifference? I am therefore interested in the negotiation that occurs between higher education institutions as they engage with the politics of indifference and different bodies' indifference and the consequences of this negotiation, the pleasures and the disappointments. Finally, a Black feminist decolonial reading practice of the Academy by exposing the flaws of using an apathetic methodology of power. In so doing, according to Dorian Corey, as I mentioned earlier, it then becomes shade. In so doing, it promotes a re-engagement with non-Western ways of knowing by demonstrating how the Academy marginalizes non-European political traditions while at the same time masking the West's role in determining those traditions. And to do these three things, these are the Black feminists that I engage with their work. And so Carol Boyce Davies, I engage with what Carol Boyce Davies refers to as an elsewhere, and also what Ronaldo Walcott, who I quoted before, refers to as a whatever. That is a traditional sensibility, granted sometimes ephemeral, but always politicized, one that recognizes that one locality cannot stand in for all. I do so as a means of moving us beyond simply referencing the Academy as colonial, but recognizing that the Academy as a nation building project is always already transnationally configured and inflected. Therefore, to imagine possibilities for those who exist in difference in the Academy requires more than a linear historiography of the space, but requires that we look to generating political alternatives beyond the Academy, as in a whatever and an elsewhere. I also engage with what Saidiya Hartman refers to as critical fabulation, to ask, what will people read about this contemporary period decades from now, and reflect on the implications of my own and others' academic gaze, scientific gaze of indifference for the continued gendering and racing of the institution through how I and others write the other into academic discourse and practice? How does my one voice and one positionality attempt to stand in for others? Who is being eclipsed? Who is missing? How does this reading practice engage several localities through connecting the legacy of colonial social construction to the body and the normal in higher education institutions as a means of excluding the other to the contemporary university's practice of diversity? By employing this type of reading practice, I make visible a common thread that highlights the legacy of oppression managed through the practice of the politics of indifference to achieve the means by upholding the Eurocentric Academy. And then I also utilize Black feminist Catherine McKittrick's work on Black feminist geographies, which are located within and outside the boundaries of traditional spaces and places, and also helps us to get to the elsewhere I mentioned earlier and the beyond the academy. According to McKittrick, Black feminist geographies expose the limitations of transparent space and locate and speak back to the geographies of modernity, transatlantic slavery, and colonialism. They illustrate the ways in which the race, class, gendered, and sexual body is often an indicator of spatial options, and the ways in which geography can indicate racialized habitation patterns. There are places and spaces of social, economic, political denial and resistance. Black geographies make clear how practices of domination sustained by a unitary vantage point, i.e., those in the university, naturalize both identity and place, repetitively spatializing where and when non-dominant groups naturally belong. So together, these Black feminist theorizings make clear the possibilities of working elsewhere beyond the obvious and to mine historical connections that reconstruct and reconnect past seemingly natural spatializing acts to the present in order to bring to the fore new iterations of dominant geographies, in which case within the academia. And so this is the theoretical frame that I'm using for the book. And now I would like to move on to pull out one of the chapters from the book. Like I mentioned, this project got me thinking about this book along with the self-care project. And so I just want to give you some information on this particular project. Like I said, what I'm going to present is beyond the scope of the book for the project, but I want you to see how the project started and how it matured and what was the final result. So I want to start this part of the presentation by asking you to imagine. Imagine that you were accepted into a college of your dreams. Imagine that in your first week, you are instructed to go into a small room with a stranger and asked to undress as they take your photo and take some measurements of your body. Imagine how you would feel. Also imagine how you would feel when the results of these measurements came back informing you that your body was deficient and that you were required to take classes to fix these deficiencies in order to graduate. What if I told you that students entering some colleges and universities in the US between the 1920s and 60s were required to do this? As you know, in the early to mid 19th century, with the development of liberalism and nationalism, philosopher John Locke stated in his second treatise of government that all men should have a natural right to life, liberty, and property, and that these rights, based on a social contract, should not be violated by governments of politically autonomous nations. The development of these two theories inevitably resulted in the debate regarding the value accorded to certain types of people existing in a nation, and who would benefit under the social contract with government. To justify difference and hence exclusion from full national citizenship and the rights that stem therefrom, those in positions of power use science. For example, social Darwinists and eugenicists, through the concept of natural selection and genetic superiority, work to prove that the Black people were inferior, also that Native American people were inferior, and also work to prove the subordinate nature of women. In addition, the development of some physical anthropological measures such as craniometry and anthropometric studies sought to distinguish those in society who were automatically predisposed to criminal behavior and the insane from those who could be considered normal. According to Vertinsky, once the concept of the average or norm entered European and American culture, a normal body type became an imperative for whole populations. Those falling below the norm could be identified by their deviant body measurements and marked as imperfect and unworthy. By 1928, eugenics was widely accepted in the US Academy, and 376 separate university courses included eugenics in the curriculum. Famous eugenicists included professors and scientists such as physical anthropologist E.A. Houghton, a proponent of involuntary sterilization, and others whose names you can read on this slide. They advocated for government interventions to promote health for future citizens, which saw the development of the increasing link between health and intelligence. As a result of this correlation between health and intelligence, increased attention to physical education and hygiene became an important part of education. At Harvard University in the late 19th century, fitness instructor D.A. Sargent credited with the development of the modern day athletics program, developed a template for the statistically average American. He would measure students as they enter the institution. Based on these measurements, each student received a charted prognosis, and if they had defects, which most did, they were given a regiment and time frame in which to remedy the defects so they could move closer to the average. According to De La Pena, Sargent's system presented a rigid standard of the normal body based on a socially constructed ideal, which up to this point was based on a racist assumption of Nordic superiority. Sargent's philosophy became popular as it was adopted by a number of physical education departments, particularly in the Northeast, and soon a practice of measuring incoming first-year students' bodies, inclusive of taking photos of their posture, became a requirement. By the end of the 19th century, posture was perceived to be under increasing threat as modern living, especially the emerging constraints of school and schooling, were understood to cause physical degeneration in youth, and a decline in good posture began to be associated with wider anxieties about character, eugenic practices, and the need for better bodies for improved breeding. Seeing physique and character as linked to posture was a way of substantiating a priori beliefs about class, race, and gender. Physical educators saw, according to Hitchcock, that crucial to their job was the development of the most perfect types of men and women in body, soul, and spirit. It is this commitment to the normal ideal that saw physical educators at schools adopt many of their methods, including wall chart, shadow pictures, as well as nude and semi-nude side, front, and rear photographs as the basis for character assessment and corrective exercises. In schools and colleges, many students were subjected to painstaking recording of their posture measurements, along with a host of skills and assessment procedures. At women's colleges in particular, there was still a lot of debate about whether or not college would be able to take care of women, and officials needed to prove that women could meet the challenges presented by higher education. College officials endorsed a model of female health that emphasized stable weight or weight gain, symmetrical body parts, well-aligned posture, and a balanced carriage, and took photos. This was done at the Elite Seven Sisters. And so to find out more about this process, we, and this is me and my colleagues at my former institution, conducted archival research and interviewed women who had had their photos taken at Connecticut College, Vassar, and Wellesley. This research uncovered that posture portraits were taken at these women's colleges of all incoming first years from approximately the 1920s through to the early 1960s for the basic course in hygiene and physical education. As Professor Elizabeth Daniels of Vassar described the method at Vassar, in your freshman year, you went over to the gym, you changed into an angel robe before entering the booth, shed the robe temporarily while your nude profile and rear views of your body were recorded, put the angel robe back on, and left. As you can see here on the slide, our participants describe much the same process. Once graded, students with malalignments were assigned to corrective classes such as rhythmic fundamentals and body mechanics. This historical positioning of physical education as a site in which the modern body has been made and remade had many effects, and it is helpful to reflect upon specific ways in which knowledge claims around the body are permeated by cultural values and yet are also empirically testable. Sandra Harding has illustrated how knowledge development and the trajectory of disciplinary paradigms are fully part of their historical era, bearing the fingerprints of these eras and the subsequent ones that practice and maintain them in their cognitive core. prejudices have no doubt bled through data, which then circle back to the same prejudices, an unbeatable system that gain authority because it seems to arise from meticulous measurement. These normalizing effects, according to Foucault, shape how generations of individuals understand themselves. And so these photographs and the corresponding system of archiving anthropometric measurements are best analyzed through an exploration of how they contribute to the development of bodies decades after they were taken. With regard specifically to gender biased effects of these photos, we need to address men's appropriation of women's bodies. The underlying idea of normalcy developed by male scientists and instituted through these photos upon women's bodies was based on a patriarchal notion of beauty and the value of women as wrapped up in her body. Because these photographs were taken in women's colleges by men, we also need to factor in the effect of the male gaze. It can be assumed that many girls during the first weeks of freshman year may well have been extremely self-conscious about being photographed nude and subsequently having their bodies evaluated for defects. And this was corroborated by some of our interview participants. Also, the underlying understanding that these photos were taken as a way to examine women's fitness to take on their roles as mothers, wives, and secretaries is important to understanding the resulting gendered panopticon, where these women needed to be constantly thinking about holding up themselves with correct and cramped postures for the purview of others. Now, over the years, these normalization of knowledges around the body have lived on to remain central today for our embodied practices, and relations remain critical to our perception of otherness, appearance, and identity. So, as such, in our project, we work to actively disrupt the legacy by recreating the posture portraits. The focal points of this project was to recreate the narrative of racism, sexism, sizeism, ableism, and to refocus the gaze, as well as to critique the academic discourse of the early to mid 20th century. One of the things we did was to utilize a postmodernist lens that understands the body not as simply a literal biological entity, but also as a social construct that can be manipulated by society. Utilizing this lens meant that we were able in some ways to escape the trappings of the modernist discourse of purely medicalized analysis and engage with ideas of agency, choice, and inclusion in direct opposition to the original concept of the posture portraits. So we set up a booth in a semi-open space and put out an invitation for students of all genders and faculty and staff across campus to be photographed. We recognize the importance of including everyone and not just female students, as well as using a relatively open space to signify freedom from pressure and utilization of choice. We also know that there are some limits to a full, true recreation, understanding how we are already conditioned to surveil our own bodies, and in some senses, we are always and already posing. However, we refocus by encouraging interactivity, comfort, agency, and openness in the picture-taking process. So for this project, we obtained 2-dimensional photo images as well as 3-dimensional point cloud data to generate abstract visualizations of the photo-taking experience. The physical presence of participants was materialized as miniature scale sculpture through 3D printing technology, constructing a 3D mesh polygonal surface to create a thin 3D shape, which you see here. This structure has a radio frequency identification tag embedded in the base so that the system could detect each model and match it with the corresponding data set for interactive visualization. So that here, when the interface is triggered, it will bring up a presentation of individual participants' experience. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So the experience of the participant is shown first here on to your left. I think is to my left. The experience of the participant is shown first through a complete image on the screen, while a recorded voiceover plays with both positive and negative body image words. representing the bodily struggles existing within us regarding our image. And so as you see, as you move more to your right, we then use a particle simulation design to represent both the social construction and destruction of the body through science, as well as the destruction of the evidence of the practice of taking posture portraits by schools. So when we did our archival research, a lot of schools had destroyed the evidence of the practice actually happening at their institution. And so each photo you see here goes from the physical whole body into the simulation. So in this short video, you will see what I'm talking about. So here, the process starts here. We're setting up for the actual photo taking process. We're setting up here in this semi-open space. We have as you can see, the easels, the 3 easels, which has information about what the process is about. Students will start to come in soon, and they'll start taking photos on this white background. And we're encouraging students in taking the photos, not only students, but faculty and staff, and taking photos to stand how they would normally stand, to stand in their posture, don't feel as though they have to stand upright and erect for our gaze as researchers. And then this particular frame walks you through how we go from taking the pictures all the way through to the simulation process. So here, this is Annabelle. She just took her photo. Now we're gonna start the infrared, which will then remove the background and then get into the process of recreating the body. So this is the image that was on the far left. And then, excuse me, you'll see how we use this simulation to kind of dissolve to, as science, as the archives, as a critique on how body was made and remade through science, and how there was a disappearance of this practice of creating bodies in the archive. So by manipulating the photos through computer technology and printing 3-dimensional miniature replicas of these bodies, we highlight how bodies have historically been created through technological and scientific intervention and surveillance, and how academics have acted as gods by manipulating and creating, producing bodies through disciplined science and the posture portraits practice. By recreating these bodies, so what we did is that we this is the how we install the bodies. Sorry, not the bodies. This was our final installation, which was in a white box gallery, which measures 13 feet wide by 20 feet long. And you can see more details on the screen here. And then I'm going to show you one other brief video, which is the actual installation experience. And then I'm do one more thing and then we'll end there.
Surrender. Close. Suffering. Close. Hurt. Choice. Faith. Catch. And then surround.
So as you saw with those mixing of colors on the screen, that was important for us to the creation of the final component of the project, an improvisational dance performance. The purpose of the dance was also to completely disrupt the notion of the uses of data as hard empirical science evidence, as well as to emphasize the discomfort of the scientific male gaze. Using dance, we sought to distill or co-create knowledge as a more spontaneous way of making the audience more aware of their bodily lived experience while watching the performance of their own bodily data creatively unfold before them. The dancer's interpretation of the audience is played out slowly before them, provoking some measure of consciousness of what it means to be observed, processed, and then interpreted. And the dance as an artistic practices pushes us to wonder and question, while at the same time helping us to think relationally as one realizes the dancer is embodying oneself, therefore invoking a sense of what we call body empathy for others. And I can give you more about this dance in the question and answer. Three brief things I want to say before I end is that the article on this project, the Posture Portraits Project, is forthcoming in the Body Journal in June 2020, so this summer. So for those of you who are interested in receiving a copy, just let me know. I also want to say two other things briefly, and I'm gonna pull up my video so that you can see me real quick. So if you can see me, you will see, the first thing I want to say is that the work, for those of you who came in and saw the first slide, I wanted to give a shout out to Trisha Cadet, who is an MFA student at Virginia Tech. And I used her art, which is on the left of this slide, for the slide. And I also wanted to shout out for her because her artwork has also graced the covers of the first book. And the one to your far right is the back cover of the book. And then the second thing I want to say is that I'm wearing this t-shirt called Uncensored Unapologetic. And this is from Jerlyn Morell's. Jerlyn is a student at Virginia Tech, and she's a master's student in sociology who's about to defend her thesis in a few weeks. And this shirt is from her company, My Pussy, My Prerogative. And so I just want to give a shout out because my citational practice is on fleek. All right, thank you so much. And I will put it over to Sylvester.